Yes, we're going to carry on the conversation here, talking about what happens at the end of the neuron. So we talked about all the events of how an action potential is initiated, how graded potentials are kind of assessed to see if they meet that conditional requirement, that threshold value, that action potential whips down that length of the axon. And then what happens to that energy when we get to the axon terminal? We know there are no voltage gated channels on the axon terminal. The channels here look different. And so what does that energy do when it gets to the axon terminal? And so that brings us to speaking about the synapse here. So we're going to start with this first objective, really understanding the difference between a chemical and electrical synapse. And more importantly for us, really kind of focusing more specifically on the chemical synapse. Okay, so for our purposes, the chemical synapse is going to be more important. It's most common in the body, and it's the most well understood. So what is a synapse? A synapse is a functional connection. So it's an area of functional connection between a neuron and another cell that it's signaling. Now, this other cell could be another neuron, and we call this a traditional neuron-to-neuron synapse. But the other cell could also be another type of cell. It can be a muscle cell, be it skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or it can be a glandular cell, which is really an epithelial cell. And so it's most often coined either a neuromuscular junction when that other neuron, when that other cell is a muscle cell. And then it could also be coined another term, which I'll talk about, which is the neuroeffector junction, specifically when that other cell is an autonomic cell. So either a cardiac muscle cell, a smooth muscle cell, or a glandular cell. Okay, and so I'll talk about the differences in those two types of junctions here in a bit. Now, when one neuron is signaling another neuron, we call the first neuron in that series the presynaptic neuron. Presynaptic meaning before the synapse, before that area of connection. And then we call the second neuron in the series the postsynaptic neuron. And so we can signal different parts on the neuron. So a presynaptic neuron can communicate with different areas of the subsequent neuron. It can signal to the dendrites, which are the fibers sticking out of the soma. It can signal to the soma or the cell body itself. It can even signal the axon terminal of the adjacent neuron. And so this creates different types of synapses. We've got an axodendritic synapse if it's synapsing the dendrites. We've got an axosomatic synapse if it's synapsing on the soma or the cell body. And then we can speak of an axoaxonic synapse when those two axon terminals are facing each other, okay? And we'll talk about that very, that special connection, the importance of that axoaxonic connection when we look at presynaptic facilitation a bit down. The most common for our purposes and the most common throughout the body, the most important for our purposes, is going to be the axodendritic connection. These are unidirectional connections between the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron and the dendrites of the adjacent or postsynaptic neuron. Synapses can also be electrical or chemical. Again, chemical synapses are more common, more important, more well understood for our purposes, but we will talk about the difference, and I will talk a little bit about electrical synapses and why they're important as well. So we said it's a functional connection between a neuron and another signaling cell, usually another excitable cell. And this can be, again, different organs, different tissues, glandular tissues, so sweat glands, salivary glands. This can also be muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle. And then there can be two types, right? Chemical and electrical. So let's start with the electrical synapses first. So we've got two neurons that are linked up together. They're connected by a structure called gap junctions. I'm not sure if we talked about gap junctions so far in the course, but gap junctions are these connections that are really these passageways in between two cells. They're like a channel, but they're not a channel. Ions do not necessarily traverse here. They're really for synchronizing the information or the activities that are happening on two adjacent cells. Electrical synapses are not very clearly understood. They're not very well understood. There's still that we don't know a lot of, there's still a lot that we don't know about them, excuse me. And if in fact, we didn't think that they existed, but we did see them a lot in the developing brain. So the infant brain is the brain that we've been doing a lot of research on and finding out much more about the electrical synapses, because it seems like they come around and they're important for development, and then they're not existing really throughout adult life. So studies are being done on the developing brain, the infant brain, and this is where we see a lot of the electrical synapses. Some features of this type of synapse: there's rapid communication because there's bidirectional communication. There's second messengers, sometimes ions involved as well, but second messengers as well. They can be excitatory or inhibitory, like the other synapses that I'm going to talk about as well. And then some of the areas that we've identified them, again, are going to be in the retina, the cortical region of the brain, some of the brainstem areas, so the respiratory centers in the brainstem use electrical synapses, and then the hypothalamic axis as well, and that neuroendocrine connection also are some of the areas that we see this electrical synapse. So really just confined to certain areas of the brain, again, more important or more common in the developing or infant brain, and not a lot else that we understand about them. For our purposes, and really in general, the chemical synapse is going to be more important, more common. We talked about the different types of chemical synapses. So you can have that presynaptic neuron synapsing on several different areas of that second neuron. It can be on the dendrites. This is the most common type of synapse. This is the one that we'll talk about a lot, the axodendritic synapse. But it can also synapse onto the soma, as well as two axon terminals synapsing. This is called an axo-axonic synapse. The area between the two neurons is called the synaptic cleft. It's usually anywhere from 30 to 50 nanometers wide. So a very small space of communication there. The mode of travel is unidirectional. So the synaptic energy will travel only from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron. And so we usually see the axodendritic, as I mentioned, but we can see other types of connections as well. Dendrodendritic are another very rare type of connection. And this is where two dendrites on two neurons are synapsing or communicating to each other. Okay, so let's just kind of review this here and talk about the different types of synaptic junctions. So here we're looking at the synapse. And we describe this as being a functional connection between one neuron and another cell that it's signaling. Okay, we talked about two types, chemical versus electrical. And again, for our purposes, this is going to be the more important synapse, the chemical synapse. So let's remind ourselves of what's happening here and where these synapses are located and talk about some of the different types. So we've got this neuron, this is our presynaptic neuron. And then we've got an adjacent neuron. Okay. Just to remind ourselves of the parts of a neuron here, we've got the soma, right? These are the dendrites. We've got the axon, and then the axon terminal. And so the area that we're really focused on is this connection. So this is called the synapse. And this is an axodendritic synapse, so the most common type of synapse between the axon of the presynaptic neuron and the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron. Okay. So this is our synapse. Okay. And so we can also label these two neurons just for clarity. So this one is called the presynaptic, and then the postsynaptic. Now, the other types of synapse are if that neuron is not signaling another neuron, but if it's signaling another type of cell. So let's draw a cell here, and this can be smooth muscle, we said this can be muscle. This can be glandular tissue. So gland, this can also be an adipose cell. And we'll talk about that in the autonomic nervous system. But these are the types of cells, either a muscle cell, gland, or adipose, that we can have as the second structure in the synapse if it's not another neuron. So it's either another neuron or one of these types of cells. Now, if it's a skeletal muscle cell, the junction is called the neuromuscular junction. Okay, so if the second cell is a skeletal muscle cell, the junction is called the neuromuscular junction. The synapse is called the neuromuscular junction, excuse me, the neuromuscular junction. If the cell, I'm going to just move it over here. If the cell is a cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or the other types of cell, gland or adipose, so I'm going to put cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, gland or adipose, then the junction is named differently. It's called the neuroeffector junction, because these are considered effector cells. So the neuroeffector junction, okay? So these are the various options that we have for a different type of cell if it's not two neurons signaling each other. If it's a muscle, gland, or adipose, the junction is named differently. If it's skeletal muscle, it's called the neuromuscular junction. If it's any of the others, it's called the neuroeffector junction. Okay, and so this is essentially what a synapse is, that area of functional connection. And so what we see here is that the electrical energy that was traveling down the axon. So remember, we had this conduction of action potentials leaping from node to node if this were myelinated, or just moving from segment to segment if it were not. But when the action potential gets to the axon terminal, we have to convert this electrical energy to something else in order for it to travel across this synaptic communication. And so that's what we're going to be speaking about today, how we convert that electrical energy from the action potential to chemical energy, and we release something called a neurotransmitter, which is what carries on the signal across that synaptic junction. All right. Okay. Any questions here before I keep moving? So this is essentially what a synapse is and how it kind of ties into what we've been talking about. Okay, so someone's asking an excellent question. Just to clarify here, are neuroeffector junctions or neuromuscular junctions also considered synapses? Yes, they are. So they're areas of synaptic communication. They're just named accordingly because it's not a traditional neuron-to-neuron synapse. Okay, great question. And so the same set of events happens here, slightly different players, but it's the same idea as far as the events that are taking place.